Dr. Colin Campbell, one of the authors of the China study, and anybody that's been close friend of Mark know that, whatever he's into, you're into whether you like it or not. He had Dr. Campbell come on his radio show that he had done years ago and read his book. Now, I remember, he'd been influenced by diet a lot, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and he's always coming up with some new revelation for you to know about. But the China study was something, man, you're not allowed to live until you finish this damn book. I'm on vacation. The only time I could read it was I was on vacation. A lot of times my brother-in-law and his family, my nephews, are on my butt, and I'm going, hey, I got to finish this book, man. So I did on vacation in New York City. And it was interesting to me, and this was 7 years ago or so. It's been a while, or more. And it was about, as I remember, it was a Asian diet. A lot of times people that eat a lot more fish, vegetables, and so on, and that the damage meats do to you at a fundamental level. And I've gone different diets, and a lot of the health consciousness, a lot of you that remember me, this used to be tight, and I was probably 40 pounds heavier, and I keep getting down. I just don't worry about that much, but it keeps going down. I get healthier all the time. But we need to know what is keeping us back. America's diet is, man, it's getting bad. And I want to make sure that we pay attention to Dr. Campbell and how we can get better. Dr. Campbell.
Well, thank you so much. Quite an introduction, if I may say so. I first want to start out by thanking Mark for having me here. I really am quite honored to be in this group. I've enjoyed this conference as about as any of I've ever attended, with these remarkable sort of free-thinking sort of presentations. It's just really a lot of fun. I, too, are kind of strayed from the flock in my profession, and so that's part of my story, really. It's also a story that began 63 years ago, so I'm trying to squeeze in 60 years worth of research into 60 minutes if I can. I want to start out just basically telling a little bit about myself, how I got into it, what really triggered my first research, if you will. I mostly spent most of my years at Cornell University and doing this research. And I want to focus on the question concerning how confusing nutrition is for the public. And by that I mean also that nutrition as a science, as a topic, is not recognized by the professionals, especially in the medical system. There's not a medical school in the United States that teaches nutrition, really. Not the kind that I'm talking about. So that's quite a serious problem. And I want to trace for you just some of the highlights of my own research, my own career, as to why should that be so. I get that right. I didn't put this up right. Just a sec. Sorry. I started out in a different place. Grew up a dairy farm, milking cows. My dad only had a couple of years of formal education. I was the first in my family to even go to college, let alone graduate school. So coming from the farm, getting into the academic community eventually was quite a new experience, quite frankly. And I could only rely on just my love for science and sort of doing research and just letting it take me where it took me. And that's me there about 7, 8 years ago or so, I guess. The most important part of that slide is really promoting animal protein consumption. I'm working on another book, not just now, and I would suggest for our thinking as far as medicine, health, and especially nutrition is concerned, there's one thought, one nutrient that really tends to dominate the discussion, most often kind of silently in a way, but nonetheless assumed. And it really is our belief in the importance of consuming animal protein in our diet. I went away to school, graduate school, at Cornell University, did a couple of degrees, my doctorate there too, focused on the idea that animal protein was so important. I mean, after all, I was on a dairy farm. we're making milk, and milk is precious because it has this really important protein. So I did my doctoral dissertation there, trying to actually, with my mentor, my professor essentially, I really was interested at that time to do the work on showing the importance of animal protein so we could encourage more consumption of it. I wasn't like anyone else. We all thought that. Animal protein is terribly important. We've got to have enough, and there it was. Eventually, I then spent some time at Virginia Tech in my first faculty position, and there we had a project with the State Department to work in the Philippines, developing a national program for feeding malnourished children. Feeding malnourished children mostly was focused in those days on two ideas. First, they needed to get enough energy, calories if you will, and secondly, they had to get enough protein. And so with my background, farm, graduate school, and so forth, that's what I got involved in, is making sure, if we could, that they got enough protein to consume. In any case, I was wearing two hats essentially. I was wearing a hat having to do with carcinogenesis or cancer, building a laboratory there to analyze for carcinogens in food. And secondly, of course, being involved coordinating the program on nutrition. But I happened to see something that wasn't published. Basically, it was my impression, based on some conversations I had with my colleagues in medicine, that there were children aged 4 and under who were getting liver cancer. Well, that was extremely odd. I mean, liver cancer among young children just doesn't happen. It's hardly ever seen, but that's what they told me, and I didn't really believe it. But nonetheless, when they told me that there were children under 4 getting liver cancer, I then learned or got the impression that these children were coming from the few families, who were consuming the most protein, the sort of Western kind of diet. And so there all of a sudden was this sort of link between high cancer, high Western diet, or high animal protein, if you will. That was enough then to get me to come home to Virginia Tech and set up a laboratory, getting NIH funding, which continued for the next 27 years, that one particular grant, just to investigate this question. Is it possible that animal protein actually increases cancer? In this case, it's a unique kind of cancer, of course. It's a liver cancer, it's children, and so forth. So that's what we did for the next, as I say, 27 years. That gave me an opportunity from that little doorway, investigating that particular question, to eventually come to some realization that this story is far larger than simply the question concerning whether or not animal protein causes cancer. This paper came out from India at that time. It's an experimental animal study where some researchers at that time were also interested in liver cancer, which is pretty common in third world countries. They were interested to know whether that cancer caused by a carcinogen that I was also working on at the same time, whether in experimental animal studies, if they could actually slow down the cancer formation in experimental animal studies, and they weren't going to do that by giving them more protein. I mean, that's how much was the cultism in animal protein that exists in our society for decades, more than a century. They thought that animal protein is so important that after these cancers started to grow, maybe if they gave them more protein, it would slow it down. And of course, it got these results here. It was exactly the opposite. And it was remarkable. The animals given the 20% of total calories as protein, animal protein in this case, as opposed to those given 5. 20% is on the high end of our consumption, 5% is on the low end. You can see there, the ones given higher protein, 100% got the cancers. Both sets of animals had been exposed to the same level of carcinogen, a very potent carcinogen. So in other words, that level of carcinogen, high protein, they all get cancer, 5% not. That in turn then supported my impression from the children. More protein, more high quality protein, if you will, more cancer. So that's really what triggered the whole initial investigation. So we'll just share with you just a couple of slides of a few hundred actually that we produced over the next 15 years or so to show you one feature of that relationship that really got me onto this whole idea as time went on. Cancer starts with a genetic mutation, by the way, as I'm sure many of you know. caused usually by chemicals that we might get exposed to in the environment. That's how cancer starts, with genetic mutation. A chemical comes in and attacks the gene, changes it, creates a new genre of cells, if you will. And so this is a little chart here showing over the first 12 weeks of cancer formation what happens when these animals are exposed to a carcinogen at 0 time and then fed 20% protein. That cancer really taken off, growing well. Just exactly what, in fact, I thought I saw with the children. In contrast, if we give them 5%, that's the same 2 levels that were used by the Indian workers, no cancer. In spite of the fact that they had been exposed to a very high level of very, very potent carcinogen that causes liver cancer. So here again was a really remarkable effect. And it was exactly consistent with what, in fact, I thought I saw in children and what the Indian workers had done. So then I looked at this in many different ways. When I say I use it rather liberally, pronoun I had a lot of students, postdocs, doctoral students who actually got involved in doing this work, and I want to give them credit for it, obviously. In any case, over that first 12 weeks of cancer formation, they get 5%. They get to 20%. The cancers are growing. It's going right up that line, if you will. Give them 5%. When we change the diet, it turned it off. We have 20%, turns it on. Give them 5%, turns it off. That observation right there showed that something that hadn't ever been recognized with cancer formation. That is, we can turn on and turn off cancer by nutritional means. And what was really quite remarkable about this, we turned it on with animal protein and turned it off either by dropping the animal protein below the level of protein we need or substituting that animal protein with plant protein. If we gave plant protein, it didn't work. The plant protein never turns it on, even when it's fed at the high level. So this is very specific just for animal protein itself. So that gave rise to some ideas, some principles that began to emerge that I began to gradually see after years passed. We did this in many different ways. I'm going to look at my chart here. So one thing is, to repeat what I said before, cancer begins with a gene. That's a well-accepted idea. It's a mutated gene, if you will. That's how it starts. And therefore, cancer is generally considered to be a genetic disease. That's bedrock assumption for the entire cancer industry, by the way. The cancer starts with a gene, and therefore you have to figure out some way to do something with genes if you ever expect to control it. Secondly, if we assume that, and if cancer starts with mutations, then we also have to make the assumption that mutations don't reverse. They're extremely rare. One chance out of a million or so if a cell was mutated. So generally, if a mutation is there, the only way we can actually stop the mutation is essentially to kill the cell. And that's the basis for the entire cancer industry. So that, of course, relates to the idea that in cancer treatment, we've got 3 ways we have had for some century now, essentially, 3 ways of treating cancer to kill cells. We seem not to be aware of the idea that cancer can actually be, the growth of cancer can be modulated, if you will. So we have chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and surgery as the 3 principal ways of treating cancer. This 4th one, nutrition, those 3 things are all meant to kill cancer cells because a presumption has been made over the years that cancer, once formed, once the mutation is there, is going to continue to progress, is going to grow. And so what this story is really about is use nutrition to control the formation of the disease. One more little feature of this kind of research too, if we get exposed to a carcinogen, I'm going to jump ahead and talk about how we relate to it, not just this experiment here, but this experiment is what demonstrated that. We're always getting exposed to chemicals all the time that might give rise to cancer. And so, quite frankly, every second of every day, in fact, we're getting exposed to some carcinogens that may form, that mutations form, and we're getting little cancer seeds. We're getting little cancer seeds that are kind of lying around there, hopefully dormant. But what this showed here is that after feeding the animal with 5% protein for 9 weeks, well, one could assume, at least I did, that possibly by that time all those mutations are gone, at least in those days. And so but instead, when we fed the 20% later, all of a sudden it started growing up again. It's sort of like a lawn, if I could use that analogy. If you make a lawn, all the soil is all clean and plowed, you plant some seeds there, the grass will grow. It'll grow. But we also know when grass grows, it only grows if, in fact, there's sunlight, temperature, and fertilizer is present. Because in the fall, the grass dies, looks brown, it's not dead. In other words, the roots of the system are still there. Cancer is essentially the same way. It's not generally recognized that we're always having some infant sort of cancer cells in our body all of our lives. But fortunately, for most cases, they don't really develop. And they only grow when we fertilize them. If we then change it, of course, we can sort of slow that thing down. So that's one of the general principles. So cancer starts with mutated genes, but grows only when promoted by fertilizer, if you will. In this case, the animal protein. And of course, those genes are always present. So therefore, as I said before, cancer is a nutritional disease, not a genetic disease. So with this in mind, and as I say, this was funded by NIH research. It was published in the very best journals. I'm getting enthused about the fact that it's accepted for being real. Then the next question became, just because of how provocative this is, that cancer actually can promote, that animal protein can promote cancer. What we then have to do, at least scientifically, one of the main questions we have to do is to sort of try to figure out, how does that work? And so we're always looking for mechanisms, sort of biological mechanisms to explain the effect. So that's what we did over a period of probably 12 to 15 years, was to look biochemically at the development of the cancer to see which mechanism is involved, which enzyme, which hormone maybe, some other kind of event that's going on in the cell, which accounts for that to occur. Because if in fact we can find a mechanism by which animal protein turns on cancer, this is really fundamental to the whole idea of the drug industry. If we can find that mechanism, then maybe we can make a drug to slow it down and block it. In fact, in this case here, we were looking for the mechanism. And every time we look for a mechanism, and that's a chronological sort of line there, occurring over the course of cancer development, divided into 3 arbitrary units, namely initiation, promotion, and progression. So we started looking for mechanisms, and I'm a biochemist. So we looked at things like, how fast does that carcinogen get into the cell? What happens to it after the enzyme looks at it and activates it? Things like, and on and along, and the enzyme that's involved. And so I'm not going to get into all these details here. I just want to say, over a period of some years, as I kept looking for the elusive mechanism, we found one. That completely changed my world of thinking about biology, quite frankly, disease formation. Because here, what we're seeing is that nutrition is not operating by one thing. It's operating by a whole plethora of mechanisms. And the most exciting part of it is the fact that all those so-called mechanisms are going in the right direction. Some of the mechanisms are increasing. Those are the ones that turn on cancer. Some of the mechanisms were sort of scaled down. They are the ones that are there to protect us against from getting cancer. So in reality, amongst all these mechanisms, 100% of them, they were changed by high protein feeding. And this happens within hours, certainly within days of feeding a high protein diet. All these mechanisms are changed at the same time. So this opens up a whole new world of thinking, quite frankly, about biology and about disease formation. It's not a question of one nutrient coming in and doing, one thing and creating a response, and then us trying to find a drug to try to treat it. That's not the way it works. But yes, that's the way we try to do it. In this case, and I'm jumping way ahead without showing you the data, nutrition is a concept, of all the nutrients in food. And there's hundreds of thousands, millions of different varieties of nutrients. They're not just 20 or 30 that you hear about. They're all working together, all of them having a whole plethora, whole spectrum of different kind of mechanisms. And interestingly, they're all working together. Stop and think about it. I'll come back to that later. But the whole idea of what nutrition really is comes back to this concept that all the nutrients in the right kind of food will tend to work together to create the response. And that's a much more powerful response than it would be if we just had to rely on just using one nutrient at a time. In any case, as I say, I couldn't put my finger on which mechanism was involved. They're all involved. But nonetheless, this is what the cancer industry is doing, is trying to find the mechanism for various and sundry things so it can make the drug to treat someone, essentially. As I said before, the protein we were using, animal protein, is actually the main protein of cow's milk. That's why I said, coming from the farm, this took a while to digest, no pun intended. But it was animal protein, casein in this case, and quite frankly, now, looking back and collecting the information together, animal proteins tend to act as a group. They all sort of do this kind of effect. Whether it's creating cancer, whether it's creating heart disease, whether it's acting on diabetes, whether it's affecting autoimmune disease, a whole host of different things. When we have a diet that has animal protein in it above the level of protein we need, and by the way, we need protein, obviously. So what I'm talking about is the protein is being added above the amount that we need, and I'll come back to that in a moment. When we look at nutrition and all these nutrients, if you will, are acting as a class, as a group, to affect a whole broad range of outcomes, now we've got something. It's a very different situation. When it acts that way, I mean, philosophically, we can sort of ask, how can all of that stuff be so integrated and so well sort of coordinated in all those activities, but working together like that? And in this particular presentation, this chart right here, what we did was to try out, instead of the animal protein, we tried two plant proteins, soy protein and wheat protein. They are considered to be lower quality, which is a fake news, if I can say that. It's not really true. I don't want, if one group of substances actually prevent me from getting disease, I would call that high quality, not no quality, low quality. But in any case, soy and wheat protein did not create the cancer response, even when fed at the 20% level. So here was another big distinction. Animal proteins do one thing, plant proteins do something different. And we have known that for more than 100 years. In the case of heart disease, blood cholesterol levels, in the case of actual physical activity. The best kind of diet for an athlete is a plant-based diet, quite frankly. It's not the high animal protein diet. So now, to come back and just sort out one little relationship here that's important to consider, and that is, what level of protein we're talking about. I mean, the mechanism is this whole bunch of stuff all working together, but in this case, here's a chart showing the relationship between the level of protein being fed, to rats in this case, versus the cancer response that occurs. That's on the y-axis. And so up to about 10% protein. Remember I just talked about 5 and 20 before? So we tried 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. These are in animals exposed to the carcinogen, all prepped to get cancer. Up to 10% protein, we don't get a cancer response. It's only when we exceed that. Well, it turns out we humans are consuming levels of protein between 11 and 22. At least 95% of us are. So and the level of protein required by rats is about the same as it is for humans. Let me move on here. That's the level of human consumption. I generalized that previous chart into just a whole host of different kinds of disease outcomes, like heart disease, diabetes, and so forth and so on the y-axis, and up to about 10% protein, disease formation tends not to occur. Furthermore, if it does occur, from the previous slides, it looked like we could reverse it. So in that case, it suggests all of a sudden nutrition is not just about preventing future disease problems. The kind of diet, for example, that prevents us from getting some of the diseases is the same kind of diet that actually can be used to treat disease. That's pretty amazing. So nutrition is not about just disease prevention, I have to emphasize. It's also, once we get to know it, we can actually use it as a means of therapy, as whole food, by the way. To put some perspective on this chart here shows the kind of numbers that or sort of benchmarks that we have in human nutrition that relates to this. That we need a minimum of about 5 or 6% protein just to sustain life, essentially. But we have scaled that up to a recommended dietary allowance for each day, and that's around 8 to 10% protein. That's the RDA. So we need protein up to about the RDA, if any of you are familiar with that. Going beyond that, we make it higher, usually by consuming more animal foods, and that's where we get to. So our average protein intake as a society is 17%. We are almost carnivorous in this society in that sense. We're consuming a very high protein diet, and 70 to 75% of that total protein is coming from animal foods. Yeah.
For the foreigners over here, just tell them what RDA is.
Oh, okay, yes. Recommended dietary allowance. That's the kind of thing you see on cereal boxes, and you see that amount recommended and so forth and so on. It's the amount of protein we need per day, or on average. It's about 8 to 10% protein. That's been around since the early 40s. So just taking this chart, this generic chart in a sense, a bunch of different diseases on the left-hand side on the y-axis and protein on the lower x-axis, it turns out that if we consume just a total plant-based diet, vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, nuts, whatever, if we do that as a whole food, that supplies all the protein we need for everything. We don't need to have more than 10% protein. And as I say, a plant-based diet can do that. But obviously, we don't do that on average. We consume a lot of animal food. And so 70% or so of our total protein intake has actually come from animal foods. And now we're in the red zone. Now we're in the red zone. All kinds of things, unfortunate things can begin to happen. Here's the way it really, and so the whole idea about animal protein causing cancer, I'm going to amend that kind of comment a little bit by saying that when fed in excess of the protein we need, that's what really matters. And so you start adding that on. Here's a list of a bunch of different diseases. When I sat down and wrote the book with my son, who incidentally is a physician now himself, actually a medical director at a major medical school, taking on this whole idea right now. And in any case, when we were sitting working on the book, I went back to the literature simply to see, has there been any evidence in the literature in past years that would suggest that this whole thing might have been missed? And here's a bunch of diseases for which there is published data in the professional literature. All these diseases have been shown prior to 2005 when a book was published. All these diseases have been shown in the past to have responded in a manner similar to what we did. Maybe not quite dramatically, not studied nearly enough as much as what we did, but in other words, this leads to an idea. The right kind of diet can control this whole host of different diseases and more. I mean, this is quite a collection of them. Some of them are quite serious, obviously. Some are a little more on the nuisance side, but it's really quite amazing to even imagine the idea of a diet that doesn't have animal food in it, creating that kind of response. On heart disease, that's one of them. I've got my good friend, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. How many of you have heard of Esselstyn? Some of you have. He's at the Cleveland Clinic. He went to go out and sometime, and I didn't know him at the time when he first started doing this, to get some patients, heart disease patients, put them on this diet. Not quite like I described it, but pretty close to it, and got remarkable results, absolutely remarkable results. He could cure heart disease by putting them on this diet. And these are all heart patients. So, for example, in the most recent publication he has, I'll just quickly summarize it here. This is a total of 196, or about 200 patients he actually had at the beginning. Over a period of about 7 years, have been counseling them. They're all diagnosed with heart disease, so this is real stuff. This is not imaginary. You had to document that first. He then put them in a 5-hour session, just giving them information, usually about 10 to 12 or so people at a time. So he had very short exposure to the idea. He and his wife do this, they eat this way, and you'll have such and such and such as this. They go home, he doesn't see him anymore. He decided to call him back 2 to 7 years later, just sort of asking them how things are going. And it turned out when he called him, it turned out of the 196 people that he was able to contact, 177 were still doing it. They got onto it and they kept going. 19 decided not to do it. That was a really interesting 89% compliance rate. When people really learn what this is, and if they've got a problem and they try it and they see results, I can tell you that makes a difference. That really makes a difference. So 89% of the people complied. And that's the numbers there. There was basically the ones who didn't comply, 67% of them, or 62% of them did have in the ensuing years after that. 62% had another heart attack, a recurrence. Only one person out of that 177 had an event. I happen to know him. He was a kind of friend of mine. I knew his wife, and she actually told me that he really wasn't compliant. So, I mean, it's really quite a remarkable result. He's getting the same kind of result with people as I was getting in the laboratory, from the same biochemical point of view. Mine was with cancer, his was heart disease. Now there's others sort of doing this as well, including my own two sons, actually. Now, here's a question I want to raise for you, especially in an audience like this. The public gets to know certain information over the years. It usually comes from the government, if you will. It should be. I mean, that's the thesis, essentially. So they make recommendations. In the government, there are two organizations that actually set policy. And I spent about 20 years myself very active in the policy arena in Washington on different committees. So I know this from the inside. I've seen it firsthand. There's two agencies. One is the Food and Nutrition Board. They're the ones that say, okay, 10% is the minimum protein you need. This is how much vitamin C. This is how much vitamin K, so forth and so on. They make these recommendations, recommended dietary allowances for all these different nutrients. They pass that off to the agency in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who then publishes in food form the kind of foods they recommend we should eat. That's the Dietary Guidelines. Haven't everybody heard of the Dietary Guidelines? So we started with the basic information on nutrient intakes and requirements, passed off to the USDA. The USDA then kind of refines all that message and makes it general. And they tell us what to eat. Okay. Here, and they do that every 5 years. This has been going on for some years. I want to just summarize for you something that kind of basically describes this process. This is a range of protein intake that we can think about, let's say. We'll put some additions onto this. As I said before, the minimum protein requirement is out 5-6%. We've known that since 1943, to be specific. We adjust it upwards by a couple of standard deviations. That's the recommended dietary allowance. So that's the kind of thing that gets them. School lunch programs are based on this. Labeling is based on this. Food composition tables and so forth and so on are all based on these two numbers here. Our range of intake, though, as a population, between 11 and 22%. So we're all above what we need. And that is achieved by most of us consuming animal-based foods. That's where it comes from. The average intake is 17%. We're high. We're 70% higher than what we need, number one. Number two, that is made higher by the very protein we should not use. If it were made with plant protein, you can get up that way. It doesn't make any difference. But if we get up there with animal protein, it's a different story. So that's what we've lived with. Every 5 years since about 1980, and I've known every one of those reports. In fact, I was very much involved in sort of get very close to sort of passing judgment on some of those things. Finally, in 2002, I think about yesterday, time is flying, but they came up with a new idea of how to recommend nutrition to the public. Instead of telling people that you need this much of each one of the nutrients, they decided to put a cap. The upper safe limit, they said. Upper safe limit, right? Mind you, emphasis on the word safe. Upper safe limit. You can eat up to this much, no problems. That was set at 35%. Our work showed that going from 10 to 20% causes really a lot of misery and hundreds of, or thousands of deaths. They set that at 35%. You might ask yourself why. Well, the director of the Food and Nutrition Board, I told you first, that's rotated from time to time. The director at that time was a guy, I won't use his name at the moment, all I do in this new book. He said that he's the most influential consultant for the dairy industry in the world. At the same time, and it's the only time it happened in the history of this whole guideline making, he was the chairman of the Dietary Guidelines Committee where the information came over. When they came out with that report, I had a couple of friends on that committee. I wasn't on that one. I called them up and said, what are you doing? I said, this is great. I thought it was a typo. And the guy I called was an old friend from 30, 40 years ago. And I said, Joe, I said, what are you doing? He was the one that was the subcommittee chair of the committee that came up with that 35%. And he felt a little defensive. He said, oh, we did this, we did that, and so forth and so on. He seemed not to know that, in fact, that 35% figure was there. Bonnie said to me, he says, Colin, you know, he said, I don't know anything about nutrition. Here he's sitting on this powerful committee. He was a great, personally, he's a great guy, but he was a toxicologist working at the FDA for many years. And he was put there because he had sort of a name and put on the committee and called someone else, and he sort of didn't know about this. I got the report, it was about 1,000 pages long. Lots of detail, very technical stuff. In that report, there was nothing to defend that 35% figure. That 35% figure came out from the news release that they prepared at the time it was released. It was the second sentence of the news release. As a result, it became the sort of the narrative for programs or school lunch programs. It became the narrative for food labeling. It became the narrative of all sorts of different things. And it's basically being controlled by the person that is this influential guy with the dairy industry. It turns out, I will tell you, this fellow and I have crossed wires somewhat. We've crossed swords, maybe, because the chairman of the department of mine at Cornell University. And so we've kind of gotten into it. But in any case, this right here is probably one of the worst cases of recommendations ever made in the history of nutritional science, because what that says, go ahead and eat what you want. It's not going to make that much difference. Eat all the animal food you want, all the protein. And anyhow, the evidence is clearly shown, not just the one I'm showing you, 100 times this sort of stuff. Yes, yes. Essentially they are. I mean, there are some differences. But animal proteins as a group have been compared to plant proteins as a group. About, I don't know what it is, 10, 12 different plant proteins, 10, 12 different animal proteins. All the animal proteins act as a group. For example, an increase in blood cholesterol and heart disease. All the plant proteins are down here. Some difference between them, but there's no overlap. And we know I know very good evidence to suggest why that's so. It's really true. All the same thing, yeah. The protein and dairy, meat, and eggs. So I'm talking about a plant-based diet, obviously. Total the whole way. And so, I mean, the results are really very dramatic. I wish I had the time to discuss that with you. It's very convincing, yeah. Right. No. It's just, yeah, I mean, this is kind of a theoretical question you were asking, because theoretical in a sense, you're talking about a single nutrient in whole food. And single nutrients in whole food do not do exactly the same, have the same degree of response as they do when measured separately. So, and also that percent is percent of total calories. I think you got that. Right, so a diet, has 15% protein as a percent of the total calories, because protein is judged to have certain amount of calories, as you know. Generally, I mean, we're playing a game of odds, but in reality, you understand that. But based on what we're now doing, actually doing trials with people, giving them this kind of diet with all sorts of different diseases, remarkable results are happening. Disease is being reversed. It's really incredible. you get a little bit too particular. I mean, you can't really narrow this kind of argument down to exact numbers for starters. We're talking about whole food. We're talking about averages, okay? So keep that in mind. And it's not just protein. It's actually all the other things going on. But the interesting part of that, and I was going to say this later, if we choose to actually make a decision, we're going to eat protein, let's say up to 15%. And if we make part of that as animal food, we're actually changing the whole dietary composition. We're changing the amount of fat generally. We're certainly changing in a major way. As we increase animal food, plant food goes down. Plant food has the really good stuff. It's got all the complex carbohydrates. It's got the antioxidants. It's got all that sort of stuff. So the protein thing is, in a sense, kind of an indicator of the kind of diet. And again, we're, as I say, playing with odds. I wish I had time to show you the relationship between animal protein-containing diets in different countries of the world for different diseases. All of them are really straight-line relationships like that, whether it's for osteoporosis, heart disease, cancer, different kinds of cancers. They all come right down right to the XY origin. It's amazing. And so, just as soon as we put in some animal food in the diet, we are, in fact, increasing the theoretical risk for disease, which translates into the numbers of incident cases. But you can't, we're all individuals, and so some people can smoke until they're 95 and claim they got there because they were smoking. But, when we look at the odds, we're playing with fire if one wants to start that sort of thing. Yeah, I've got some more things. Can I hold back? I won't get enough time to show you a couple of maintenance. Okay, if I can hold your questions just for a second. So I have a new definition for nutrition, skipping over a whole lot of argument for this, but I'm really confident of this. I think nutrition is a different kind of biological effect than the usual thing we tend to think about. We tend to think of individual drugs doing various things, right? We tend to think of individual nutrient things doing different things. That's not the way nutrition works. That's pharmacology. That's vastly different from, I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about nature. I'm talking about when we eat the right kind of food, all the nutrients in this class of foods over here, the animal foods, and all the ones over here in plant foods, they're dramatically different. And they're operating together. They're working together. And I first really got enthused about this idea when, in a sense, I spent much of my career feeling like I was working inside of a cell. All the different parts of a cell. We've got 10 to 100 trillion cells in the body. And within that one cell, it's as complex as our larger universe that Dr. Fisher talked about in a sense this morning. This cell is a representation of, in a sense, the whole universe with its complexity. And when you start looking at individual reactions in the cell, and all of a sudden you start to realize, when you're doing the right thing, all those reactions, as infinite as they are, and we'll never in science determine the exact calculus of what those reactions are. They're all doing, when we have the right kind of food, we're all doing the right thing, and they're working together. You can ask yourself the question, I have, and I've been reminded of this, who's the leader of all this? Where does that control come from? I just call it nature. But it's really quite an exciting concept. How all of this is just woven together in all the reactions, each affecting the other, so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So I call this holistic nutrition. The way we've been working with nutrition, we work as a pharmacological discipline. Nutrient supplements, by the way, don't work. We've known that now. So you can't use nutrient supplements to hope to achieve what I'm talking about. It really doesn't work. You might see some apparent benefit over the short term, but that washes away. It disappears essentially. So let me go to the next step here. So I'm saying it's a highly interactive, integrative, whole system, essentially, without making animal protein a cult. And that's what it's been. I've gone back to the book I'm writing right now, is working on the history of this field back to the late 1700s. We adopted a cult in the middle 1800s when animal protein was first discovered. In any case, I say that. That's what nutrition is. Then we get to medicine, the practice of medicine. All the wonderful things people do in medicine, good people and all that sort of thing. Quite frankly, it's a reductionist practice. It's built on that. That's use one thing, usually a drug, occasionally maybe a supplement, to achieve a certain end. And so we look at all these different parts. We take them out of context. We make an industry out of it. That's medicine. So medicine is reductionist in nature. One disease, one cause, one mechanism, one targeted drug treatment, usually foreign chemical, which adds another dimension to this argument. And this is why, it's really important, this is why holistic nutrition is not taught in reductionist medical schools. This is why doctors, of the 130 or so medical specialties we have, that sort of guides the way for reimbursement, not one of those 130 is called nutrition. So they're really, for the most part, almost impossible for doctors to get compensated, even if they knew this. So they're not trained, essentially. They're not, I mean, all these good people, their time has been driven down that road. And I'm not totally, obviously, against the things they do. There are a lot of good things being done, obviously. But leaving out the first course of action to take and rely on the second level of effort is not a very smart thing to do. How much more time do I got? Okay, real quick. I got into trouble with this, and this is something I want to throw out here for this community here. The first time that I started seeing trouble with this, I was a member of the National Academy of Science panel, 1980 to 82, on diet, nutrition, cancer. That was the first report from the Academy ever done, the first official document done by our government over the years, if you will. It was the most sought-after report in the history of the National Academy at the time. And I was one of the 13 members. I was the only one on the committee who had really done experimental research in the nutrition area. And I got myself in a pickle because I was arguing that we should have a chapter on protein. My colleagues didn't want to have a chapter on protein. So ensconced they were in the idea that animal protein is really important. So I wrote a chapter. I got known for it. I gave testimony. The Academy had me give testimony before congressional committees, and was on PBS and this and that. I get a lot of exposure. Shortly after that, some things happened. We said something really only modest. This is 1982. We were the first to say that we advocate fruits, vegetables, and grains as a means of reducing cancer risk. We said we should reduce dietary fat down to 30%. I wasn't too excited about that, but that's one of the things they said. Again, a very modest, kind of useless kind of comment, to be honest about it. And we also urged then, too, there was interest in nutrient supplements. We said they don't count. They're not likely to work. And I spent 3 years, actually, the chief witness in a Federal Trade Commission hearings on that, just try to refute that premise. But anyhow, they don't work. The chapter, I insisted on chapter on protein. I wrote the chapter, got known for it. Didn't intend it for this. I was kind of naive in those days. Wrote a chapter on protein. That really went up in flames, in a sense, as far as the public is concerned. So the industry really kind of just took it to me in various sunny ways. This is, I say, 1982 to 85. I'm just sort of throwing this out here because this is my first experience with the system, in a sense. It was proposed that I be expelled from my professional society, the only one of its kind. And there was a hearing held in Washington. I escaped it. It was a unanimous decision not to do that, but the people who were proposing that I'd be thrown out of my society for betraying my community. That was the story. So that was one thing that happened, and then the executive council, I was to be the new president, and the election was held at that time. They turned that over, so kind of thing, get out of here. Then there was a letter circulated by some principals in Washington to 32 individuals around the government that I had taken money from my grant. That was, of course, all false. And then finally, I won a new round of funding for our study in China of $7 million. That's pretty tough to get that kind of funding. It was recommended and approved for funding. I come to Washington, pick up the check, or at least a down payment on the check, and I was presented with a letter from one of the directors of the Institute, basically saying, they said, Friends of the Institute of Aging, that's how it was signed, that the work we were doing in China, not generally known then to the public at large, that basically it was all fraud from that, and so that $7 million went down the tube. It's the only time I've ever known, I've been on both sides of that table, that the money was pulled back. So I realized that I kind of stepped in it pretty knee deep. And it's been going on ever since. And that's another part of the story. I'm only just telling you this because the kind of things that go on behind the curtain, so to speak, and that's my tentative title for my new book, is the reason the public tend not to know this. It's the reason the public does not to know this, and they haven't really known this, especially in the case of nutrition, what it can do for more than 100 years. It's just part of our narrative. And one of the reasons for that, as I say, is that the science itself is defined by reductionist principles. It's confusing. If we only think of one thing at a time, all these different nutrients, and then we have a marketplace full of wild claims. No principles, no guidance. People tend not to know. And of course, at the present time, I'm quite busy trying to tell that story and get it changed around because I think it requires essentially a different philosophy of what nutrition is. The public need to be told. And I don't know, I'm going to skip over some stuff here because I know I got my 7-8 minutes. Forget that. At Cornell University, where I get quite a lot of heat, I've had the senior position at the university for many, many years. But nonetheless, that didn't stop them. The dairy industry come in and now built a $106 million building, put a little monument outside with that right there on the campus. That's what academia has become, subservient to the industry. It's just that simple. Let me share a couple of things with you. I'm going to skip that one real quick because I want to get to this point here. Here's basically a really serious problem. This was essentially academic freedom over the years between 1970 or so until about 2010. It's been declining, going down. Now it's almost non-existent. I'm one of the few people, more than 9% of the people in the country in academia that actually has tenure, and I've been able to get away with that. It's kind of saved me in a sense. While that is happening, that's the green bars going down. The red bars is increase in funding from the industry. I'm calling that groupthink. It's, you get the concept of that very well. You all know that. Oh, your tenure is where you're guaranteed a position for life, but put it very simply. You know, when you're a professor, for example, it usually takes 7 years. You got to cut your teeth and do your right thing, and then you get reviewed at that point in time whether or not you might be entitled to have a position, for the rest of your life, as long as you didn't do something illegal. That's what tenure is. A lot of protection. I've had that. In fact, when I was recruited back to Cornell in 1975, I got the position with tenure and with the endowed chairs at the same time. I was given the whole boatload of all the credentials I needed. And it was really great during that time. It went all off on the rails when I started talking about this. And this is really serious. And I want to come back and share this with Mark. And I think it's germane to some of you folks here. One of the things about the public not knowing is they're not being told the knowledge. I feel that the kind of changes that are going to have to occur is changing the whole discussion of what the knowledge base is. People can't make decisions in their own best interest if they don't know what it is. And the whole system is so controlled. And in my experience, sitting on these committees, labeled government committees, National Academy committees, agency committees, and so forth and so on, we always have to have a couple of corporate representatives on the committee. I am a free market guy, big time. That's not the issue. I'm totally in favor of, corporate interests and all that sort of stuff. But quite frankly, they are controlling the discussion on these matters here, setting national policy. And if we can only rely on spreading knowledge, and we can't do it because of various mechanisms in place. I know I'm skipping over a lot of stuff here, but I'm just throwing that for discussion. If we can't do that, how do you actually manage doing something worthwhile for the public if you can't tell them what, in fact, we really know? Because most people haven't heard about this kind of story before, and so they're not getting the benefit of it. I can argue easily that there's at least, it's easy to estimate, that 75% of our total costs, healthcare costs, I like to call it disease care costs, 75 to 80% of our disease care costs in this country could be abolished overnight, in theory, if people ate this way. But they're not being told. They're not being told. And from my perspective, the only job I feel that I have a responsibility for is telling the information like it is. And from a public perspective, I feel that it's important for us to share it. I'm not into regulations. I'm not into any kind of enforcement, this, that, or anything else. I'm just simply make the information available. But then the question becomes, how do we create the information? Who's going to take responsibility for that? So that's the question. I can't answer very well. I think that's my end. Oh yeah, just let me share this with you. This is such. Okay, you can see that cow there. These are affected industry causing problems. Basically, the industry sells says eat our food. You know, drink the milk, eat the meat, eat the eggs, eat the meat. That's the way it's been for 100 years. The cow says, is that? Says, eat the bad food and not, sorry that got left off. Eat the food and not stop eating my flesh, basically. I listened to Dr. Fisher this morning talking about these emergent properties happening over the eons of time that he talked about. I'm going to fill in his number 9. I just was listening to him. I just typed it up there real quick. And I'm suggesting that recognition that eating the flesh of our cousins, and I was not into animal rights. That was not where I came from. But from the science perspective, I have to acknowledge that's a fact. We've got to come to realize that we should not eat animals. The cost of that decision is serious. It's having a major effect on our environment. It's having a major effect on our healthcare costs, in addition to just personal health. All of that's coming to the fore, and it's going to be here before you know it. And so I think that, we've got to take this seriously. How do you go back and sort of define this particular question in a way in which the public can understand it and proper decisions can be made? Thank you.